PEN America is committed to freedom of expression all around the world. In the wake of President Donald Trump's March 24, 2019 executive order on campus speech, PEN published Chasm in the Classroom, Campus Free Speech in a Divided America. It discusses the administration's constricted account of free speech threats emanating only from the left, and it details an array of infringements on speech, both official and informal. This report is a balanced view of what is happening on campus and how best to respond to it. I spoke with Jonathan Friedman, who is the Campus Free Speech Project Director, on how to think best about the crises on campus, how to resolve these issues, and how to move forward without relying too heavily on our courts and our administration to solve things that are perhaps best settled inside the university.
Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay, oh yay, oh yay.
Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome. No, this is not cabaret, it's Think About It, a podcast about the power of ideas and how language can change the world, with Uli Baer. So I'm really happy to be here today with Jonathan from the PEN organization. You're the project director for Campus Free Speech for PEN. First of all, welcome.
Thank you. So excited to be here.
I've known you in other incarnations. You've also been a faculty member, and you have a degree and a Ph.D. in higher education on global higher education, which led you to a lot of research about how universities function. And can you tell me, when you arrived at PEN, what's your mandate and what are you trying to achieve? And because PEN has not always been as actively involved in universities. It's been present, but it's not really been actively involved. And I want to talk about what your ideas, how we can help universities think through these issues that relate to speech, etc.
Sure. So at PEN America, our mission is to really celebrate the written word, but then on the flip side, to defend the civil liberties that make it possible. So we are an almost 100-year-old organization that really intersects the worlds of literature and human rights. And we have a number of lines of programmatic work, and one of them is focused on campus free speech. We got into the campus speech debate at the end of 2015, and we've been in it for the past few years, producing reports, doing campus engagements, really trying to present a unique perspective on some of the tensions that were happening on campuses. And I think the question you ask about how can we help universities and colleges and administrators and faculty and students to understand some of these issues, I think that is the question that orients our work, very much trying to think about proactive solutions, guidance, advice, a philosophy, principles that can really help people navigate these issues who are facing them on the front lines day to day. We have seen in the past few years the politicization of campus free speech as a concept, as a battleground for much larger political forces in society. And at PEN America, we're really trying to make sure that most campuses, can find ways to create the conditions that support the most speech for the most number of people, but in ways that are also cognizant of other values in higher education: equity, diversity, inclusion. To us, we see these value sets as mutually reinforcing, and a lot of the talk about these issues often pits them against each other, but we're kind of unique, and we say, in saying and in trying to put forth ideas about how administrators can uphold both at the same time.
You've issued a report, you've published several things with Suzanne Nossel, the director of PEN, who's been on this podcast, giving people real, direct, concrete guidance. You've published principles, you published this report called Chasm in the Classroom, which is a book in itself, really, which is sort of the state of this matter right now. And when you said something a minute ago, you said the politicization of this issue. Do you think there was a moment when this issue, this has been with us since at least the Vietnam War and free speech movement in Berkeley, but do you think it's become more politicized, this debate, than before in earlier instantiation? Because you're a scholar of higher education. I've had, Robbie Cohen on here, who sort of had written the books on Mario Savio. But is it more politicized than in earlier periods or decades?
Yeah, so my former expertise was really in the history of globalization in higher education, which in the 20th century has ebbs and flows. And it's really kind of the same with free speech. They have different crests, different moments of getting more attention and of feeling like they're in the front seat of higher education and the back seat of higher education. So there's been no question that the issue of free speech, we think of the 1960s, the free speech movement at Berkeley, there's no question that these issues have been around for some time, but certainly 15 years ago, 10 years ago, these issues around free speech were rather dormant. You weren't picking up the newspaper or following trade magazines in higher education that were routinely commenting on the latest outrage, the latest infraction, the latest censorship. So there's no question that there is a kind of heightened scrutiny to the point that really has caught, maybe it's not catching anyone off guard today, but certainly a year or two ago, as this was gaining more momentum, we can see a wave of faculty, for example, who suddenly discovered that their Twitter could be grounds for them to be fired, for them to be not rehired, for students to organize protests against them. And really, we've seen this across the political spectrum. I want to emphasize that no group has a kind of monopoly over how they call for censorship or call or claim offense at someone's words. We've really seen this weaponized by individuals and groups on both sides of the political spectrum against their, adversaries. And it's a dynamic, right? So with greater politicization, polarization in many fields of society, as we've seen in recent years, it's a dynamic at play, a kind of tit for tat, where even within the same, incidents or controversies, how we bound them and how we think about when they begin and when they end often involve different groups kind of throwing censorship and free speech and the concept back at one another until these things settle in the dust. And, we move on to something new.
Right. And you're coming from a place of really strong defense of freedom of expression globally. Salman Rushdie was your president for a while, who teaches at NYU in this very department here in journalism. But there's a commitment that free expression is the kind of underpinning of democracy. But you're not a legal organization. You're not the ACLU. I've talked to people from the ACLU. You're not just looking at it through the lens of one particular legal framework, let's say First Amendment or something, but you're taking a view that it's inherently good to have as much speech and expression, right? Because you have an organization of writers who are all deeply committed to this. You're also dealing with a lot of people who've been penalized or harassed or, imprisoned for what they've been writing. So your mentality is it's very important to protect speech against the overreach of the powers that be.
Yeah, especially now with so many repressive governments around the world who are really taking serious measures against people that threaten their lives for things that they write, for journalists around the world, for scholars. In many countries, there can be more significant, consequential threats to people's livelihoods and lives from things they say. And at Penn, we really are a big tent organization, so we're nonpartisan. We try to draw as big a circle as we can around some of the principles that we support. And it is somewhat humanistic when we think about how we really couple the legal principles that we draw on with our kind of deep embrace of, just the flourishing that can be made possible by artistic expression and by holding to a really core belief that, as you said, free expression for all, right, for the most speech by the most number of people is essential to how we envision a democracy working, right? That's not always neat, it's not always civil, but it is a kind of core bedrock principle, in our view, underpinning a lot of these debates. And so we're trying to really make people remember that. At the same time, we do have an interesting kind of dual mission because of our literary past, and it is distinct from many other organizations, ACLU and others, which is that for us, we have long also felt that it's really important to do work lifting up marginalized voices. So we have numerous programs at Penn America which try to really make the case that free speech and democracy only work when the greatest number of people are able to access their voices, to find their voices, to get access to the public sphere, to be celebrated in the public sphere. So that kind of idea of diversity and inclusion has long been core to Penn America alongside our defense of free expression. And so we have a longer history of thinking about those terms as kind of mutually reinforcing.
And to say something about those two words, diversity and inclusion, which are, contested, debated quite a bit.
Sure.
But you just said something else, is to bring people into the conversation also, to empower those people. So in some ways you could look at it either as diversity and inclusion, as a kind of nice, tolerant, kind of more passive approach, or you're saying Penn is committed to giving people access to the marketplace who are not in the marketplace for many other reasons. Nothing to do with what they say, but actually how they are positioned in society, etc. So
right, upbringings, class.
Right, all sorts of reasons why they're not: money, what power, etc., etc. So you just wrote this book, Chasm in the Classroom. It's 150 pages, I think. It's pretty massive. And you try to take stock of what's happening and then end with some guidelines. If you could say something first, how do you think university administrators, teachers, and students should look at this? Should they just go to the back of the report right away and say, what do we do with the next issue or crisis?
Right. Where's the core advice? What do I do? So the advice is coming. One of our next products is going to be an online guide to all things campus free speech, and it's going to be taking some of the findings from the report, some of the principles that we've been articulating for many years, and really parsing those into quick, ready-to-use checklists, a compendium of sample statements and sample policies, case studies of how people have reacted in different ways. So the resource dimension of this is one that we've been very conscious of and the one that we are in the midst of putting together, hopefully for launching in the fall. But when we were putting together Chasm, there was that moment when it just ballooned, like any kind of authoritative report on a topic as fraught, as complicated, as nuanced as campus free speech in the past few years. The report did get longer, but we really did feel a deep commitment to wanting to give all of these different perspectives and different issues their due. And one of the things that we're really trying to push back at Penn is the kind of rise of quick takes, superficial arguments that really work and have been inflamed because they speak to the stories that people walk around in their heads with. So if you're a conservative person, you have a story that you have been reading about and thinking about. If you're a liberal or a progressive student or faculty member, you have a vision of what's been happening on college campuses. And the two really don't speak to one another. They increasingly don't read the same media. And so whenever the latest breaking news happens, it's, if the story confirms what I already think, then I'm just going to take it as truth and shrug or move on or tweet about it and then go on to other things. But almost all of these campus controversies, and we know because we really tried to present an account that is so balanced, the balance of which is really unparalleled by other accounts in the sector and on this issue right now, that necessitated a kind of deep engagement with a lot of these issues. And on most campuses, you have what emerges in the media, what bubbles up that we think happened. There's the accounts of many people who were there, the witness accounts, which often do differ about who did what first, when someone said something, who's to blame for a set of circumstances that unfolded. And a lot of the time, we do have administrators who make a decision about something, but a lot of thought and complexity goes into those decisions, and it's totally unaccounted for in, the university did this, the university did Y. And, you've worked in universities, I've worked in universities. Anyone who has worked in universities know that universities on the inside are complicated, they are segmented, they're kind of, I think the famous word is fiefdoms. Different individuals may not necessarily agree. And so, what is a university from the outside is really different on the inside. And so that complexity is completely lost and passed over when we talk about, what happened at Middlebury or what happened at Berkeley or what happened really just at any of these colleges where there's a lot going on. And the other thing that's really often lost in public debate and public commentary on these issues is the backstory to a lot of things. So, if we decide as a university or as a set of administrators that we're going to take some action, maybe we're going to decide to give in to a student demand that will be ridiculed for giving into, sometimes there's a lot of backstory there. There's the fact that we were actually already considering it before the students demanded it. Or maybe this is the third time the students are making that demand. Or maybe there's just a great deal of backstory. Maybe it was a razor-thin decision. Maybe it was like really close, like we voted and it was, 11-10, and we were really actually quite torn about that choice. And we spent a lot of time thinking about it. But, at the end of the day, we had to ultimately make some choice that made many of us uncomfortable. So, all of that is lost when we're like, oh, they did this today. Let's get upset about it.
And it's also interesting that then all universities suddenly looked from the outside as if they make these decisions and this is the wrong decision. There are many decisions made all day, every day in all sorts of workplaces, institutions, organizations, etc. that could be right, that could be wrong, but they don't get that kind of attention. There are people being hired and people being dismissed, or there are people being treated well or not so well, and sometimes they have legal recourse, sometimes they don't. But universities excite the passions more than other things.
Certainly they've come to, and they've come to occupy that special symbolic place. And there's no question that if we think about like all the decisions, let's just take politics, all the decisions being made at all the levers of government every day, do they really command the same kind of attention? Universities are they're fun to criticize. There's a playfulness there. It's a convenience of like a familiar punching bag. And I'll also say, as soon as we start critiquing one or two or three, suddenly the other interesting thing that happens is it's all of them, right?
I think another thing I would touch upon based on your earlier work, you're an expert in global higher education. I worked in global higher education for quite some years. What I learned is that all governments take an enormous interest in their higher education. And even in this country, where we don't have one national university system, we have state university systems, but we decided at some point that we were not going to have a university. In the early 1800s, Jefferson set up the University of Virginia, but not a national university. But governments care and people care, which is very interesting because there's also a lot of suspicion about universities now in America, which is, I think, really lamentable. But our government cares greatly about universities. Our president just issued an executive order. Our attorney general has weighed in. The previous one has weighed in. And it's not the Department of Education that really just cares about it. So there's a political interest in universities, and I think it has to do with it. The next generation is shaped how to think about their own country and themselves. So there's something happening in universities that these are just kids, they're learning stuff, but they're going to be the citizens of our nation.
And it's worth stressing that none of that is particularly new or contemporary, right? That's, the university, you mentioned that most governments today care about higher education. That is true. But in many ways, if you look at the history of some of those dynamics, it is in the U.S. that the idea of mass higher education really catches fire, really spreads the whole notion of professionalism, right? That each career requires a master's degree in order to succeed in it. That is an American invention in the late 19th century with the growing middle class. And those are the concepts that have really 100 years later spread around the world. I don't know if it's fair to totally call it Americanization. It's not that Europe didn't have universities, but really the notion that higher education is, college for all.
I think Europeans would remind you a few hundred years
Yeah,
before.
well, yes, but for an elite,
For the elite,
right?
absolutely.
It's very different in the United States. And we see that here in the development of sport, right? The popular, let's not forget football is, when you think of college, you ask people what do they associate with college, football's got to be the top one or at least in the top three. Higher education commands a great deal of attention, not just in the policy makers' minds or in the public's minds, and not just in that kind of training generation mind, even in just kind of more lackadaisical, it's a great time for everyone and it's important in our development. And it's just, everyone looks fondly back on, their carefree college years. So that really puts a great deal of pressure on higher education.
And I think the final promise that in America, it's the promise to enter the middle class. And that has probably also been complicated by rising tuition costs and the systematic underfunding. So the funding has actually lessened from state and federal levels, but it's become more expensive. And it used to be the kind of lever. And so this is how you access the middle class American dream.
Well, once the GI Bill comes in after the Second World War, you have this flood of veterans coming to colleges, and it really ballooned the college population, and we haven't really undone that. So really it is in the second half of the 20th century where that American dream becomes realized by a greater number of people, and we're still living with that legacy and trying to figure it out.
And I would think the other two big trends that I've tried to really think through is that the elite colleges start admitting women in the late 60s, which is barely a lifetime ago, and they start admitting minority students in the late 60s under enormous pressure from the civil rights movement. Really, until then, very little participation. So there's a kind of democratization, let's say, a really good development. And this takes us to today, where you think this is all good. Actually, I always thought higher education was improved in the 60s when people challenged the kind of conservative, elitist institution that just produced people who are just going into, sort of upper middle class jobs. Actually, universities became better, more dynamic, more entrepreneurial, and we owe to universities some of the greatest economic miracles in our nation. So all the tech companies, a lot of them were actually sort of birthed in conjunction with universities. So why this kind of frustration now today? Why don't we just say, well, this is just kids and they're going to, act out a bit and there's issues being worked out and we can move on? Why is this a tension there when someone comes? Do you think that with the report you did, why do these flare-ups gather the attention of the entire world, not just the country.
Yeah, so these tensions were there. I want to go back a little bit historically, right? So these tensions were on campuses when I was a college student. A speaker is coming to campus and there's a group of people who are angry about it. Certainly, social media changes the ways in which information about these incidents, can be fanned to a larger group of people much more quickly. So that's one key change. But the other is a diversifying student population who comes to college with new ideas and new expectations of what it means to belong there. And there's no question there is a legacy at a lot of higher education institutions that hasn't necessarily examined all of the ways that it accommodates all of these students. So many institutions, for example, have brought in higher numbers of international students in the past decade, 15, 20 years. But it's really only the richest institutions that have the money to say, oh, we have a great number more Muslim students here now. Well, maybe we should give them somewhere to pray or accommodate their food choices, right? So that change alone, that demographic change alone just from international students, really has posed many challenges to many institutions. But for domestic students as well, you have just kind of the shifting demographic that says, we want to be taken seriously, we want to be treated equally, and that has raised new questions, new tensions with principles of free speech. And all of that was kind of there, and then boom, Trump. And, if you really think about coming for young people who grew up in the era of Obama, for, the way that their parents, spoke, let's say if they're liberal parents, spoke glowingly of Obama, for many of those students, they really thought that Trump couldn't happen. Many people thought Trump couldn't happen. Trump was supposed to be an impossibility. And, now we're 2 years into this or 3 years into this, and still people are kind of walking around in a daze of disbelief that there could be a president who flaunts so many rules. We thought the rules had already been flaunted before. There's a long history of presidents towing the line, pushing the boundaries. But somehow Trump really has smashed all of those records. He lies so regularly, and he is now, as we speak, pushing back against any measure of accountability and oversight by the Congress at all. I mean, that is totally, I believe, almost totally unprecedented in the obstinate.
That is what liberals think. And then you have a large part of the country who think he's finally broken with the pieties of political correctness, and he's called out that this is all politically motivated. There's no legal or constitutional basis for any of this, and he's finally cleared this fog of liberalism, identity politics, accommodation, and there's a bit of robust. And there are lots of people,
including
most of the senators in the Senate, who think what he's doing is probably fine.
Well,
or don't speak out. So in some ways, I just think it's interesting that what you're saying, that he's also opened up a space, right, for people to finally say what they felt they couldn't say, which they had been saying on the internet for quite a few years already. I mean, if you were following Breitbart News regularly in the year leading up to the election, you had a good chance.
You certainly can't separate any of these social phenomena from one another, right? So Trump doesn't happen in a vacuum. He happens with social media. It's not a coincidence, right, that Trump was very good at Twitter and kind of seemed to master it first. It's not a coincidence. We think of Trump as the person. We talk a lot about Trump, the person, but of course it's not just a person. It's a phenomenon, right? It is, you point out senators or the greater public who felt somewhat stifled and, pushing back against political correctness. And those tensions are very real on college campuses. So Trump certainly, in terms of higher education, seemed to, open up a space and seemed to condone movement into the mainstream of, white nationalist or white supremacist ideas. Many of those groups now avowedly trying to recruit more students on college campuses, circulating propaganda, putting flyers out on college campuses. They certainly are acting in bolder ways. We see that in protest, quote unquote, or riots at the University of University of Virginia in Charlottesville. So there's no question that Trump, opens up that space and contributes to these dynamics. And, if we look at the most extreme protests by students, some of the most insistent protest actions against speakers, they all happened after Trump was elected and now they've kind of died down. They certainly died down since the midterms. There is a remaining question about whether they're going to come back, and I'm talking about incidents like students blockading the building at Claremont McKenna, some of the more violent efforts by whether they were students or whether they were masked Antifa protesters. It's unsettled, at Berkeley against Milo or at Middlebury against Charles Murrow. So some of those incidents, which really commanded so much attention, and we cover them in our report, it's important to note that they did all come on the heels of Trump and that they haven't necessarily continued or gotten worse. And so there is this particular moment where these, it's like a clash of different ideologies and a clash of different echo chambers.
I do want to ask you about one incident, Missouri, which I think precedes the Trump election.
Right, yes.
And it's really about due process under the law, and it's against police brutality, and it's in the name of Black Lives Matter. And there the football team actually joins a kind of student protest and says, we're not going to show up for a game. The president resigns. So there's actually student pressure around an issue around race under Obama. That was a moment, I think, when universities said, wow, the students are not really satisfied with how the institution is working for them. At Missouri, which was, integrated 50 years ago at that moment, so in some ways. And then the administrators, some of them resigned in response to this, maybe to actually help the institution. I don't, details are not that important in a way. What's important, I think, is that there is this tension, but what you're saying after Trump, then this tension gets national attention each time. Each time there's an incident, the entire country looks at it and says one of two things. Universities are failing. These students are out of control. Or the universities are failing because they're not helping us, the students, really study here. So this is the narrative is sort of the university is at fault. So I think your guidelines are really useful because universities are kind of caught in this really terrible place. Either they're failing because they're not allowing conservative speakers, or they're failing because they're not allowing the students to really participate. But it puts the university in the middle of something where you said earlier the university is sort of acting in good faith and trying to create a space for everybody to speak, but it gets attacked essentially from both sides.
I mean, it's worth pointing out that the zeitgeist, if we think of it that way, of like administrators and how they think and how universities work on the inside, really, I would say, like on the whole, tends to be probably more conservative. And not necessarily conservative in terms of like their visions of a political future, not necessarily conservative in terms of visions of equity or diversity and inclusion, but I mean conservative in terms of change and in terms of proactive steps. If you're a hallowed institution, if you are an established institution, you have to be careful about the choices that you make that might, jeopardize your reputation, that might give you bad press. So higher education, regardless of Trump, regardless of the free speech issues, higher education was always under some kind of, gun in some way on some issue, many issues around, sexual assault, around adjunctification of the labor of professors. There were many issues going on college campuses and pressures. The question was, what are the levers that really push the university to change? And so, like, where possible, the university wants to study its choices. It wants to, let's establish a task force on that. Let's take our time. Let's really think, right? There's a tradition of thinking in universities about these decisions, which we were discussing earlier. And so I think with regard to racial issues in higher education, we were at a moment in 2015, 2014 with Black Lives Matter, with, evidence in many sectors of society that, look, racism is kind of still a major problem in the United States, and that many people who are on the brunt of that feel it's being unaddressed, putting new pressures on higher education. I don't think anyone could have predicted that somehow out of the strange convulsions of politics and higher education that the result could be now what we have with Trump, and where higher education, where these issues around race and free speech are now. But there's no question that one of the undercurrents of a lot of challenges on a lot of college campuses at their core are about race. People like to say racism, if you compare the United States and Britain, they say, race has always been like the core problem in the United States, or the core social issue. And in the UK, it's social class. It's not a perfect comparison. But there's no question that there were groups who were agitating for those kinds of changes. And, if you have never experienced what those students were claiming to experience, right? If you've never been in their shoes, if you've never walked into a room and been, the only student of color, or had someone, in the office of your building ask you because you're a student of color that you must not belong there in the business school, or maybe you're lost, those we call those, I think like microaggressions, or maybe their acts even more like just accidental offense. I think a lot of times people don't necessarily mean badly with them, but they accumulate, they have a significant effect. That effect is real, it is lived for people. And there's no question that has been one of the most significant undercurrents in what we've seen explode on college campuses in recent years. It's not the only undercurrent, but it's one of the keys.
The guidelines you give in this report, so you talk about things like microaggressions, safe spaces, trigger warnings, campus speakers, how to regulate or not regulate faculty speech. And what you just said is really interesting. When universities usually they meet in a committee, they have a task force, and they look at this because they actually have a structure of, let's say, faculty and student governance as well. So they want to meet with people for 10 months, and then next March I'm going to issue a report on what we should do. That is not possible in today's day and age, when you can have something happen on campus and within minutes it has been viewed by hundreds of thousands of people online. So what you're trying to do is sort of say, okay, here is something you can refer to, a bit of a manual to say this is how you can prepare for these things. And this is how you can claim and assert and explain your values, but also respond. And I think this response time issue is really hard on universities, because the whole university is not set up to respond within minutes. That's not how we operate, actually. We're not the FBI, or we're not a police department. Actually, it's not as, first responders. It is actually about thoughtful responses.
Absolutely. I mean, most universities don't, or maybe now they do, but they certainly historically wouldn't have a policy on what to do when neo-Nazi flyers are pasted all over campus. What should we do? How quickly should we say something? At some universities, what I've been told are there are sometimes racial incidents that the students affected by them actually don't want the university to talk about them or publicize them because they feel like it gives the act of aggression more oxygen. In other cases, students, faculty, when they're attacked, there's nothing more than they want than a swift, powerful denunciation of acts of hate. And for many universities, if you hesitate in that moment, whether it's the president, whether it's the provost, whoever it is, to take, what is the right action, you're going to be losing some part of your community. And so what we're trying to do is remind people of those commitments. And a lot of time it's things people think anyways, right? So a lot of times it's, a president of a university, of any university in the United States, I can't imagine thinks that we should have swastikas on campus. But when it comes to denouncing that, there's this pause where they have to think about, either legal repercussions of what I'm about to say. What can I say? What can't I say? How should I say it? How soon should I say it? And so this, totally, again, referring back to what we were saying before about what all the nuance and the complexity is lost in the public commentary of these things are the deep internal debates. I mean, I gave you a simple one, a swastika on a campus. There are ones that are much more complicated and much more thorny for people to make quick decisions on.
Let's stay on the swastika on campus one. It's a useful example. It's happened, and one would think common sense would dictate to say, well, that's something easy. You'll condemn this right away. But there had been a moment when people said, well, it's expression. We want to be careful. There's what Fred Schauer, a legal scholar, calls First Amendment opportunism. Someone will say First Amendment. You remember Skokie. They have a right. And then you're realizing, but this is a college campus, and this was pasted on someone's door, on a student's door, or in a classroom, or found as graffiti in a bathroom. This is a community that actually has some values. And what you propose in the guidelines at the end of this report, you say the university should defend and protect free speech, but it should also make its values clear and apparent all the time and speak out very strongly in favor of its values, even when something happens on campus that seems to contradict that. And I think that is a really difficult balancing act. It means you can endorse free speech as a principle, but you want to be careful not to condone the message. And you lay that out pretty carefully, how that would happen. And it's not just presidents, it's college teachers, students themselves actually have to do that.
And I think really there are numerous people who are leading higher education who are actually doing this and who are getting the message and who are trying to practice it and who are learning from one another, whether indirectly or directly, and starting to kind of get this idea. And I think that's actually really important to recognize and to, I don't know if I want to say celebrate, but to affirm that in what we're angry about or what we're upset about day to day means that there isn't a lot of time to say, hey, this university, you did a really great job yesterday in talking about that.
I'll tell you that one thing. I used to be in the university administration, and I used to joke with a friend of mine who now runs a college. He's the president, and we said, how many times did people send you chocolate, flowers, and champagne in the last 2 weeks because you prevented some crisis? And that doesn't happen.
Right.
You're supposed to do your job. It's supposed to work well. And when it doesn't work well, you're supposed to be there to absorb the blame. Right? So when things work out really well, no one really calls the president and says, thank you for making a week go by that went really well. That's your job.
Well, and actually what's also often lost is just how deeply torn many administrators feel about these situations. And I mean that administrators in a very broad sense from the top, from the high levels, senior levels of administration to lower levels. Many of them actually feel quite torn about, when can they say things? What can they say? How do they maintain political neutrality? I was told by an administrator, she really goes out of her way not to wear political buttons for anything, because she would really not want to alienate anyone. So administrators have gotten this really bad rap. I think a lot of times we're incredibly uncharitable to administrators. Certainly critique is necessary. Critique is important in the public sphere. That's part of how we keep colleges and universities accountable. But we can sometimes, I think, cut some administrators a little slack or say, this is something we want you to learn from. We can, think about asking the same thing that we ask of our students to learn from their experiences and their mistakes, et cetera, as they move forward. But I think the point you make is really important also with regard to free expression, thinking about context, right? So the context of the act that we're talking about is really significant. Free speech, free expression, when it is done anonymously and when it is an unambiguously hateful message, right? That's easy. It gets much harder when we're talking about political slogans that kind of can be interpreted one way and can be interpreted another. So if you say build the wall, if someone writes that on a campus or if someone is walking around a campus chanting that, it's actually much more difficult to say 100% that is hateful to all people. In fact, many conservative students would tell you, and I have been told by some of them, that they don't see that as a hateful statement at all. They don't mean it in a hateful way. I think that such students could learn. We could ask those students to listen and learn and think about and reflect upon how to be more conscientious in their choices. But for the administration, that's a much more difficult situation for them to weigh in on quickly when a lot of the details may be obscured about who said what. And, it's not the only one. There was this situation at Emory University, actually before Trump was elected, where his name was put in chalk on the campus, or I think it said Trump 2016. And many students were, lampooned for reacting really strongly to that. But for a lot of students, they said it was kind of just like the trigger of deeper feelings of insecurity or unsafety. So it wasn't necessarily Trump's name alone they were saying shouldn't be on campus or that shouldn't be allowed. I mean, that is absurd, right? He's running for president. But it raises out these challenges.
It's a nice, different example from an extreme symbol of hatred like a swastika. But Trump, he's also our elected president. Sometimes it's just a name. It's a political campaign. There are many candidates in there. If I put a name on the sidewalk now, if I say Beto or Biden or Kamala or Pete or whatever, and someone gets really offended or upset by that, what should a university do at this moment? And you've weighed in on this and said it's probably not a great idea, according to this report, the way I understand it, to have free speech zones which were set up during Vietnam War protests to allow the campus to regulate its space more safely, to say there's a space over here, you can all demonstrate. We don't want this everywhere and all over the place because it disrupts traffic and we have problems and there's going to be security, etc. So what should they do when someone is chalking up the campus plaza, if you have a plaza, or the entrance of a building? Do they have a right to do that?
Well, in most cases, the students do have a right to do that, right? Or whoever's doing it does have a right to do it. In most cases, the biggest challenge of so much hateful or borderline hateful or ambiguous speech is that the people doing it do have every right to be doing it. And so I think, if you haven't done anything before that moment, if you haven't done anything proactive, we were talking a minute ago about announcing your values and educating students about that. I mean, what we have found when these things have happened in the past 2 years is just incredible misinformation and different understandings of what can be said, what can be done. Is that, you ask, well, is he allowed to do that? You have administrators turning to one another who've never faced these kinds of situations.
Also, not all constitutional lawyers.
Yeah.
Even constitutional lawyers. Stanley Fish said, first of all, administrators should not play the role of moral philosopher. And secondly, in private universities, the Constitution doesn't really regulate everything.
Totally.
So in some ways, you're saying they're at a loss. What should happen beforehand to make the campus deal deal with such an issue or incident more successfully?
Right now, we're pushing this message of how to be proactive around these things. That's what we've learned from seeing them unfold, right, over the past few years. Is like, oh, actually, this is something that we need to build into the kind of core training and core education and core messaging around like what happens on a college campus and what students are, quote unquote, getting themselves into there. I think, in the moment, one of the things that we've also seen is that if it is a hateful message, even if it's an ambiguous message, of course you want to say and explain to the community that this is an act of free expression, which we condone and we support. But that doesn't have to be what you lead with. That, if a student is coming to you upset about something, you don't have to begin with, well, free expression and close your door. You can, begin by offering support, by listening, by most of the time, as I said, a lot of these things, they aren't themselves the issue. They kind of just become the conduits for deeper issues and for deeper conversations. And so it's about having those conversations and about practicing listening. So I think there's a lot that college campuses can do now that we've seen the effects of this and we're living through this moment of deep polarization to make really clear to the campus community, what are our values? What are the rules? What are creative ways to confront that? If someone is chalking a message, what more powerful reaction than to simply ignore it or to chalk something over it or chalk something near it? I think a lot of time we have developed a lot of sensitivities around speech, which could be more strongly met with satire, with eye rolls, with backs turned, with aggressive speech.
I liked what you wrote about these ideas of all the things you just mentioned, that there are different responses to it. First, I'm going to say something about listening, and then the other responses, which you just included some that people would be outraged by. No, you can't chalk over, you can't turn your back, you cannot disrupt anything. But the listening part is interesting. You mean an active kind of listening, not just listen, then say, okay, First Amendment, and close the door again. And in some ways, that, I think, hasn't worked at all. I think how people hear that is to say, I'm going to protect the right of that person because I like that person's position. And that conflation of I'm defending that person's position, students don't trust enough anymore to say, I trust that you actually also hear me out. And say, I think you're just giving the benefit of the doubt to that guy who's chalking. And that's not really a community then anymore. That's just kind of a divisive breakdown. And maybe students are setting it up this way, but then administrators have to be the ones who say, what is your concern here? Is your concern that there's chalk on the sidewalk? No. What is your real concern here? Do you believe that this does not allow this campus to work for you?
Well, there's no question that these are it's easy to, I think, sit and opine on what it is people should do in the moment, right? When we're talking about, a lot of people in a lot of different contexts, a lot of different situations. This is what I mean when I talk about like being a little charitable to people. People are human. Humans have their flaws. But really, the message I have is that the best defense against some of these challenges is strong offense, right? So, what can you do when students arrive in freshman orientation? What institutional statement do you have to point to that says, look, we really value inclusion, and we also really value free speech, and we see them both as mutually reinforcing, and we're going to apply those principles as much as we can. It's not always going to be perfect. There's going to be situations where people's feelings are hurt or where there are sometimes really serious consequences from free speech. But, turning back to that kind of humanistic position on free speech that we take at Penn, ultimately we believe in the kind of greater democratic good of free speech. And what we've seen lately is out of the weaponization of these situations, state legislatures across the country are jumping the bandwagon on this to pass new laws that would mandate discipline for protesters. It's found to be, I think a lot of the language is around quote unquote infringing on other people's expressive rights. It's exceptionally vague from a legal standpoint. What does that really mean to infringe on someone else's right? Could you be found guilty of not speaking over someone but somehow preventing someone else from hearing? What exactly are we talking about here? And when we get into questions of speech, it's actually really thorny to start to say, when one person is talking, when they're interrupted, right? Heckling has a really central place in the history of American political engagement. Democracy is messy. Abraham Lincoln used to give speeches and was heckled all the time.
I'm going to interrupt you for a moment. I'm exercising this idea. It's actually interesting you say this. Jeremy Waldron, who teaches here and has written on hate speech, he says heckling should be allowed and encouraged. It's good when people actually ask a question in the middle of a lecture. He said that is robust debate. That is not really the climate right now, that there's a lot of universities now. I was at a university 2 weeks ago at a conference, Harvard University. They have a recorded announcement before every speech that anybody who will disrupt a speaker or block the speaker from view, will be asked to leave or ejected by security officers. And I thought, so if you stand up and turn your back toward the speaker, you can be thrown out of that room. And I thought, but there are many, many things I could get thrown out for. I can eat, or I can, leave my garbage behind, or I could sit on the wrong chair or put my feet up. There are all sorts of rules in universities that don't have to be announced. This one they announced. And you're saying there should be a little more tolerance for saying students could stand outside of a building and chant.
Yeah, why not? You're going to, in your building, come outside and tell us what we can and can't do on a public sidewalk, right? Think about that. Think about what we're talking about there. It's just a lot more complicated than simple laws and rules. In the Harvard case you mentioned, at least they're saying the rules beforehand, right? A lot of times the rules are kind of vague and subject to the judgments of the campus security involved. And maybe that's good, but maybe there's challenges there. What happens when one campus security officer makes a decision to cancel an event when maybe the speaker wasn't exactly being disrupted? There's this idea that these are simple issues, right? When you're talking, when you're interrupted, right? You interrupted me a minute ago. That was our conversation. That's part of engaged, robust debate. But I do think there has to be a line, right? And I do think that, if you are invited to speak somewhere, that if you are being given a stage, if you're trying to speak to an audience, if people are playing music over you, right? We've seen this on college campuses where students, or maybe they're not even students, but where someone is coming next to you with a cowbell and you can't talk at all. I do think that is like crossing a line of disruption. And I think that's really different from a single heckle or two heckles or three heckles at different moments. And I also think it's really perfectly all right for administrators. And in fact, what we should be asking of administrators is to come out and issue a warning to students or others if they're disrupting. I think that warning that says, look, we tolerated your disruptions up to this point, but now is the moment, 5 minutes in, 10 minutes in, whatever it is, the third heckle, that now is the moment that after which we're going to have to take a more serious, we're going to have to approach this with, a more disciplinary orientation or throw you out or that sort of thing. I think that's okay. I think that's important. So, I think we have to be careful that these situations not devolve into total, circus. But I think a little circus and a little provocation, I think is okay. I think, in fact, in most circumstances, it's really interesting to remember that the speaker has the right to speak, and we really want to defend those speakers' rights. But the students or the protesters, they've got rights to speak too. And that's where regulating expression is so difficult.
I want to touch on one issue you mentioned in the report and the principles at the end, which I think really are useful. And I think they would be a great thing as starting a discussion with students, faculty, administrators in the room. And as you pointed out earlier, on all levels. Because it is not just the president and provost. It is sometimes literally someone who is a valued staff member in the dining hall who has to deal with things suddenly because there's some eruption of some kind of controversy. And you say that when external speakers are funded by external agencies, the university shouldn't interfere and shouldn't stop that necessarily if it gives students the authority to invite speakers, but it should be cautious not to skew it in a way that some groups have huge amounts of resources and funding available to external funders and other ones don't. Because that can introduce another kind of imbalance to say they're getting funded by big national organizations to bring speakers on campus, which don't exist on all sorts of sides. So how should universities deal with that, especially when you're a smaller college and you have somebody come in and say, we'll pay the speaker an enormous amount of money, enormous meaning $15,000. That's enormous for academics, and we'll bring them here. And another student group says, we'd like to bring people, but we don't have those organizations on our side. Should the university have a conversation about this? What is happening here? Because does it skew what is actually happening on campus through outside influence?
I think one of the things that's really important to remember when talking about higher education is some of the unique aspects of academic freedom and university governance. We were talking about that a little bit before. And so when we talk about like the campus community and why it's so important to make this like collective education for all, making the rules clear to everyone, but we also have to accommodate the fact that like a professor might, be able to and should be able to completely 100% criticize and disagree with the choices of the administrators in their own university. And that's really a strange thing for most people in most jobs, right? That only exists in the university. And so how do we wrap our minds around that? I mean, it's a good way of thinking about, well, these are kind of special institutions that have to play by special rules, and they have to really be very thoughtful around a lot of these things and being proactive around these issues. On the question of, security or security fees or speaker fees and what universities should do, what I often say to people is, in all of these campus speech debates in a moment of incredible polarization, and nobody really wants to do this, and it's hard. I don't even necessarily like doing it, but is to really just flip all the political actors involved and think about whether your feelings would change and whether you would still feel it was fair. Maybe it's now Young America's Foundation, spending a lot of money to bring speakers to college campuses. Well, how would we feel if that was Black Lives Matter? And of course it's not, and there are power dynamics involved, and there's a legacy of social class and racial dynamics here that's at play that I'm bringing up. But just ask yourself, do you think that that would be fair if whatever it is you're describing was totally flipped? And if you can't say that that's fair and that's equal, then we have to think of ways that we move toward fairness. And so one of the things that we really do think a lot about in advocating for free speech and inclusion, in advocating for proactive steps for universities and university administrators on all of these issues, is really asking themselves. And similarly for political leaders, for Trump, there's no question that his executive order and some of the state level legislatures that have passed laws have been motivated by Republicans who really see free speech as only a conservative issue and just totally ignore all the instances in which people on the left are attacked or at the source of these.
Bring up an example. You talked about the executive order and the conversation with Suzanne in an editorial for CNN. And you said there's at Kennesaw State there were 5 cheerleaders who kneeled during the national anthem, and they were not put back on the squad. They said, well, we can't prove this, but you said this hasn't made national news.
Right.
That actually student athletes exercised their political right, their First Amendment right to express their viewpoint on something, and they were not put back on the squad.
Mike Pence and former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, Betsy DeVos, they have all played to the kind of normative conservative lines about what's going on campuses and how the college students are out of control. It's completely biased. It's completely unfair. And it's really problematic. And so when our elected leaders are being so partisan in how they're telling the story, it's especially difficult to be asking, their adversaries on the left to be generous and kind to conservative students on campus. But the reality is that if we're going to teach students that, for example, the group Students for Life is always talking about the ways in which its students are attacked on college campuses for their pro-life advocacy, if we're going to say, that's okay and that's free speech and those groups should be allowed, we're not going to get there by continuing to demonize people on both sides. We need to get to a space where everyone kind of brings down the temperature on a lot of these issues. And I think it's about reminding people that democracy is messy, right? So when we talk about free speech and why we think it's important to society, it's about reminding people of the alternatives, which are, how people used to resolve disputes. So the core of free speech, the core is so core to democracy because it begins from a moment of accepting that I'd rather not be at war right now, right? I'd rather not be fighting you, so let's talk it out. That's where all of these rules came from. If you haven't been part of war, if you haven't seen a civil war, right, it's very distant to us. We've forgotten that. So there's all this talk about free speech today, and it feels really abstract. What does it really matter if I want to shut down this speaker who's pissing me off or rally around something or engage in civil disobedience? But again, if we're going to ask commentators to be generous to the protesters, if we're going to ask the leftist students to be generous to the conservative, Christian students, if we're going to all kind of quote unquote get along, I think in some ways we have to remind people of that core reason or social compact that we're asking people to buy into that undergirds a lot of this. And I think people have forgotten that.
I'm going to add one thing, and I know you agree with me, that some students and some people and some faculty will say, yes, a lot of people have forgotten that this is a better option than being at war. But some people say a lot of people in this country are actually continually under attack. And I think it's what you said much earlier. It's not accidental that race is usually the kind of flashpoint for these debates, sometimes sexuality or gender, but it's really race. And in the 90s, it was really obscenity and pornography. And now it's really race. And that some people would say, we live in a country where we don't have due process or equal protection under the law. We're not even safe from the police. And they would say, we know what it means to have no option to speak. So in some ways, I think what you're proposing, I think is really important to say. People should remember this is the better option. You're going to have to bring people into it and say, this is really a better option for you, and you can trust that this will actually benefit you. I think that trust is a really hard thing to reestablish for some people who feel, well, I've been sold this bill of goods for a long time. It's going to be really good for me to just listen and speak when my community is under attack in a way. And I think that's what this comes out of sometimes and comes on college campuses. I think you're saying we're working out the messiness of democracy. We're also working out what equality really means, which is also really complicated. It's not easy I quote this a lot. Jefferson Healy had hoped that equality would be as self-evident and obvious as a mathematical formula. And he said, regrettably, it's not. So you have to impose it on people.
That's a great quote.
But it really was troubling in a way. And he said, I'm going to set up an education system. He said, equality is something you have to learn. You're not born with it. That's like free speech. It's actually not something you're born with. We have to learn how to enact it.
Well, and I think some of the most powerful messages, right, that people, think about Black Lives Matter and why did that message resonate so powerfully with so many people, black, white, whatever. And it was because it seemed to hit upon a deeper truth, that the message was a kind of goal that we could all aspire to and believe in. At the same time, the pushback against that movement, which has been equally, vociferous and strong, raises other tensions as well. And so if our biggest problem is social movements fighting against one another, I know it feels really significant, and it is. And I don't want to downplay the significant challenges that many people in this country are facing with hunger, with employment, with livelihood, and that some of those dynamics are deeply, obviously classed, but deeply racial and gendered as well. It's very important that we have ways of bringing attention to those, and it's for those reasons that we have to defend free speech so powerfully, because it's through speech that those ideas get articulated. It's through speech that people can organize around those principles and organize for change in positive, productive ways. And, there can be change. There can be movements politically. There can be political gains that can be achieved for those groups. There's no question that those were the issues at the end of the Obama presidency in particular, and a kind of feeling like, well, if you can't achieve these things, then who's going to? That was the kind of moment that we were in at the end of the Obama years, was a feeling that among many that he hadn't quite achieved the things that we thought he had aspired to. Perhaps he would say, similarly to Jefferson, regrettably, this actually was a lot more difficult to do than I thought it was 8 years ago. There's no question that for many communities, for many individuals, they do feel under attack, and we should be listening to that and to those feelings and, giving those feelings their due and trying to amplify them and giving them a space. If those are the, quote, voices of the marginalized, let's listen to those voices more. But we risk a deep breakdown. We're on the precipice of a breakdown around these issues. Maybe we're already past it, where the echo chambers are so strong and people are so closed off to one another around these things. I mean, this didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen with Trump. It's been coming for a long time. In many ways, we see the antecedents of this in the way that Newt Gingrich, when he was speaker, the way that his deep opposition to Clinton. There's always historical echoes to these things.
I'm going to ask you something about the way which pen is going to be useful. So there are 4,000 universities and colleges in America. You can't go to all of those campuses. In this resource, how can they make this usable for them? You can download it. It's on the website. You have summarized principles. What is the best way for a college or university to think this is helpful for me?
On one level, what we're trying to do is set the record straight on a lot of these developments and remind people of the complexity and the nuance necessary to understand the scope of what's happened on different campuses or with different pieces of legislation or with attacks on particular faculty, to be a kind of authoritative, detailed voice on these debates, on these issues, the authoritative account of what's happened. And on the other hand, we're going to be taking our principles and turning them into other forms of guidance and advice for administrators, for faculty, for students. And I think at the core, though, it's some of our philosophical messages that will ring the most true, and they do resonate a lot of the time around, what are the proactive steps that you need to be doing to address these issues, to lay the groundwork for people when they arrive on the campus, so that, the campus is a community that we all understand the compact that we're buying into by being there. And I think that the more that universities can be open and explicit about a lot of those values, the better off they're going to be.
Mm-hmm. You had a bunch of events over the last couple of years, panel discussions or such things. Are you going to continue to be involved in those kinds of things?
So we continue to imagine ourselves as trying to be thought leaders on a lot of these issues and helping people to understand them and understand how we are thinking about them through our commentary and through our analysis. And we do continue to take advocacy for particular cases where we think, something could be changed or undone or redone or done differently. And we do continue to do a round of campus engagements as a regular part of our work. We really believe in the importance of trying as much as possible to remain on the front lines of these issues so that our work is relevant to people. One of the things that we'll be doing in the next year is reaching out to more specific targeted administrative communities. For example, like residential advisors is one of the ones that we'll be trying to tap into a little more to understand what are the issues in residence halls. But there are other realms as well, and we're really very open to partnering with campuses, to continuing to do dialogues on campuses, helping to organize public events for campus communities and the broader public in general to help college communities educate and understand, core principles and how free speech and inclusion can be put together.
When I'm listening to you, two thoughts, and I thought it would be useful and important probably to invite and involve journalists, because I do think they can't really get the texture of what happens in university and colleges. They hear something, they have to interpret it as smart as they can be. They don't quite necessarily know. If they were on a panel and really heard and were actually put into this situation to listen deeply to other perspectives on this, and politicians, because I do think the debate has been framed in a slightly odd way, and your report here, Chasm in the Classroom, really adds much more nuance and takes examples and says, this is useful, we can learn from it, this exemplifies and explains something else. So if politicians and journalists were invited into this, I think it's actually useful to talk with faculty and students in the setting of the university. And Penn here has a really useful function because you're neutral. If it's a university organizing it about itself, it's a little bit sort of the university's introspective. But if you're saying Penn can co-convene something or co-sponsor this, I think it gives the university some breathing room to say, we can actually look at ourselves here for a moment. And we have somebody from the outside participating.
And that's been one of the advantages to our work to date as a kind of neutral third party coming in, especially when we're convening a dialogue of a number of individuals who don't trust one another, who are from different political backgrounds. And I said to someone, we're not just trying to bring people to the table, we're trying to be the table. But on campuses as well, one of the groups that is also extremely relevant are student journalists. Many college campuses have seen their student journalists attacked for things they've written, but at the same time, it's actually student journalists and student newspapers, college student newspapers, which actually usually contain a lot of the detailed, nuanced complexity which is being lost in a lot of the national media about what's happened on a college campus, about what's happened after on a college campus, about what different people on the college felt about something and how they reacted to it. And you can really appreciate and understand that complexity much better by picking up, the college newspaper and talking with student journalists.
Jonathan, I want to thank you, and I want to thank you for writing this incredible short book on the speech controversies, which I'm sure will continue to be updated. So it's a really great resource, and I want to thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.